I know you wouldn't believe this, but what if everything you were taught about Black history in America was a blatant lie? Not just distorted, not just incomplete, but deliberately rephrased. You were told your roots began in chains, that your ancestors were stolen from West Africa and brought to America as slaves. Period. End of story. But what if that's only part of the truth? Or worse, a carefully constructed myth? A banned DNA study, buried for years, uncovered something so explosive it threatened to expose the very foundation of American history. The results of this study is that Black Americans are not just descendants of Africans. The data pointed to something far deeper, far older, and far more powerful: a strong genetic presence in ancient Native American populations. And even more shocking, evidence that Black people were in the Americas long before Columbus ever set sail. So ask yourself, who buried this study? Why were its findings suppressed? And what are they so afraid of you discovering? This isn't a conspiracy theory. This is genetic science, dismissed because it didn't fit the narrative. It challenges everything: textbooks, race categories, even land rights. Because if Black Americans didn't just arrive on slave ships, if they were already here, then the system we live under was built on more than slavery. It was built on erasure. And now, the truth is rising back to the surface through DNA. This is the story they never wanted you to hear. And once you do, you'll never see your identity the same again. For generations, we've been fed the same watered-down version of Black American history, a version that starts abruptly in chains, sails across the Atlantic, and begins in 1619 with nothing but sorrow, captivity, and struggle. We're told that Black Americans are the descendants of enslaved Africans who were taken from West Africa, stripped of culture, and dropped into America's brutal plantation system. That's it. End of story. No past, no complexity, no deeper roots. But here's the problem. That narrative is not just incomplete. It was designed that way. It was crafted to erase everything that came before the boats. If our story starts in chains, then freedom looks like a gift, not a birthright. If our history begins with slavery, then identity becomes survival, not sovereignty. This mainstream version erases agency. It removes thousands of years of rich, complex cultural identity, both African and indigenous. It disconnects Black Americans from the land, from lost tribes, from spiritual roots that predate European arrival. And that's not an accident. History as we know it was written by the victors, the colonizers, the lawmakers, the textbooks. They didn't just conquer lands, they redefined people, reclassified entire populations, erased tribes, and renamed nations, and made sure Black Americans never fully knew who they were, only who they were told to be. But here's where things take a turn. In recent years, something powerful has been quietly challenging this whitewash narrative. DNA, cold, hard biological evidence that doesn't lie, doesn't have bias, and doesn't need permission to speak. And what's revealing? It's not just shocking, it's revolutionary, because DNA is uncovering connections Black Americans were never supposed to know, and histories they were never meant to reclaim. So now we have to ask, what if Black Americans didn't just come from Africa, but were already here? What if the truth was buried, not in the ocean, but in our blood? And what if the biggest lie was that your story began in chains, when really, it began with kings, nations, and untold power? Let's go deeper. What if your blood could speak? What if it could whisper the names of ancestors erased from history, and shout the truth that textbooks refuse to tell? That's the power of DNA, deoxyribonucleic acid. DNA is the microscopic thread of life found in every cell of our bodies. It's the biological code that determines everything from your skin tone to your hair texture. But it also holds something far deeper: your ancestry, your story. And here's what they don't tell you. DNA doesn't lie, but the people who interpret it can. Now, let's break it down. There are two major types of genetic markers used to trace lineage. The Y chromosome, passed down only from father to son, follows your direct male line. It's like a torch carried through the generations, unchanged, unbroken. Then there's mitochondrial DNA, or mtDNA, passed from mother to child. It traces your maternal line all the way back to your earliest grandmothers. Together, these markers form a genetic breadcrumb trail, one that scientists use to map migrations, build family trees, and unlock the truth of who we are and where we come from. But here's the catch. When these trails lead to places that disrupt the official narrative, like evidence that Black people were present in the Americas long before Columbus, the trail suddenly goes cold. Studies vanish, researchers are discredited, and funding disappears. Why? Because DNA doesn't just tell stories, it threatens systems. In the early 2000s, multiple DNA studies found genetic markers in Native American remains that pointed not just to Asia, but to ancient African lineages, long before the transatlantic slave trade. Some of these results were labeled contamination. Others were buried in obscure journals, never reaching the public. A few brave scientists who tried to publish these results found their careers stalled, silenced, or ignored. But the suppression was even deeper. Take the story of Henrietta Lacks, a Black woman whose cells were taken without consent in 1951 and used to create the first immortal human cell line. Her DNA helped power medical breakthroughs, vaccines, gene mapping, and cancer treatments. But her family never gave permission. Her genetic code was literally harvested, commodified, and distributed globally, all while her descendants remained in poverty. If even her DNA could be exploited without consent, what makes us think modern DNA research is immune to bias or control? See, DNA is not just about genes. It's about truth. It's about reclaiming stolen names, erased nations, and forgotten civilizations. And when the truth doesn't fit the system rewrites the script. But not anymore, because Black Americans are turning to DNA not just to learn, but to unlearn, to challenge every lie they've been fed, to reconnect with a legacy that is bigger, older, and richer than slavery could ever define. And trust me, what DNA revealed will shake the foundation of everything we thought we knew. Imagine spending your entire life being told who you are, only to find out that the people who told you never really knew, or worse, never wanted you to know. That's what many Black Americans are now realizing, thanks to DNA research that wasn't just controversial, it was buried. Let's start with one of the biggest players in the historical narrative, the Smithsonian Institution. For over a century, it shaped how Americans saw themselves and how Black history was told. But behind closed doors, their scientific research began to reveal something they couldn't explain or refuse to acknowledge. In the early 2000s, the Smithsonian launched extensive DNA testing and archaeological reviews of ancient remains found in North and South America. These weren't recent skeletons. Many were thousands of years old. But here's where things got strange. Some of these remains contained haplogroups commonly found in sub-Saharan African populations, markers that, according to mainstream history, shouldn't have been there. These were pre-Columbian remains. That means before Columbus, before slavery, before any so-called African migration. What were West African genetic markers doing in ancient American burial sites? Instead of publishing these findings with transparency, internal reports were shelved, certain researchers were pushed out, and the data quietly disappeared from the spotlight. Some called it academic caution, others call it historical erasure, but that's not the only case. Let's go back even further to a man who dared to say what Western scholars wouldn't. Cheikh Anta Diop, a Senegalese historian, physicist, and anthropologist. In the 1960s and 70s, Diop began conducting bold biological tests on the skulls and skin tissue of ancient Egyptian mummies. He wasn't just trying to prove they were African. He proved they had melanin, wide nasal indexes, and cranial structures consistent with modern Black populations. Diop's work shattered the Eurocentric myth of a white Egypt. But instead of being celebrated, he was ignored, dismissed, and even been banned from publishing in key academic journals. Why? Because if Egypt, the foundation of Western civilization, was in fact black, then the entire racial hierarchy that justified colonialism, slavery, and white superiority would begin to crumble. Still, Diop didn't stop. He once said, "To make African history accessible, you must first remove it from European libraries." And he was right. But the truth didn't die with Diop. It only evolved. Fast forward to the 1990s and early 2000s. DNA studies began testing indigenous remains from North America. One, in particular, conducted at a Midwestern university, but later unpublished, revealed something truly earth-shattering. Several ancient Native American skeletons, dating back thousands of years, carried haplogroup E1b1a. If that code doesn't mean much to you, here's the translation. It's one of the most dominant lineages found in West and Central African males. Let that sink in. Long before any ships crossed the Atlantic, black people were already here. But instead of rewriting textbooks, the study was buried. Funding disappeared. Some of the researchers who tried to speak up were warned, and one even lost tenure. One whistleblower, who spoke anonymously in a 2007 podcast interview, said, "We weren't supposed to find that. When we did, they told us to rerun the data or discard it. I knew then that science wasn't neutral. It was political." And he was right. This isn't a conspiracy, it's a pattern. When DNA tells a story that challenges the colonial script, it gets silenced. When ancient bones whisper the truth, someone tries to cover their ears. And when Black Americans start questioning not just where they came from, but what they were before slavery, the entire narrative begins to unravel. They want you to believe that your history began with chains. But what if it began with crowns, pyramids, and forgotten empires? What if the truth has been hidden not because it's wrong, but because it's too powerful? These banned studies aren't anomalies. They're breadcrumbs on the trail back to a stolen identity. And the deeper you follow them, the more shocking the truth becomes. DNA doesn't lie, but people do. This isn't just about West Africa. It's about something much deeper. Let's start with something bold. There were black people in the Americas before Columbus ever set foot here. We've been conditioned to believe that African presence in the New World began in 1619, but archaeological and genetic evidence suggests otherwise. Take the Olmecs, for example. One of the earliest known civilizations in Mesoamerica. Those colossal stone heads, broad noses, full lips, and undeniable African features have sparked global debate. Historians tried to brush it off as a coincidence or stylized art, but DNA analysis and skull morphology studies tell a different story. One that points to African presence in ancient America thousands of years ago. Then there's the Washita Moors, often called one of the oldest indigenous groups in North America. Their oral history speaks of dark-skinned people who didn't arrive by boat. They were already here. Early European maps even show tribes along the Mississippi River before transatlantic slavery began. Coincidence or covered-up truth? It doesn't just end there. DNA doesn't just tell us where you're from. It tells us how long you've been somewhere. Mitochondrial DNA, mtDNA, passed down from mothers, and Y-DNA, passed from fathers, have been found in ancient American remains that match genetic markers seen in modern-day Black Americans. That's right. The bloodline of some of the people here today matches bones dug up from thousands of years ago, before the first slave ship ever docked. In some studies, haplogroup A and E1b1a, both associated with sub-Saharan Africans, have been found in Native American remains in the Americas, particularly along the Gulf Coast and parts of the Mississippi Valley. These findings were either ignored, challenged, or dismissed as contamination because they didn't fit the accepted historical script. Ask yourself, why would indigenous American remains be showing African DNA before Africans were supposedly brought here? Real-life DNA tests that tell a different story. Now, here's where it gets personal. Many Black Americans who've taken commercial DNA tests, 23andMe, Ancestry DNA, MyHeritage, are reporting unexpected results. Of course, many find West African roots, as expected, but others are discovering indigenous American ancestry that they were never told about. And not just trace amount, in some cases, 20 to 30% Native American bloodlines. Even more shocking, some are finding Middle Eastern, North African, and Semitic ancestry that links them to regions like Yemen, Morocco, Israel, or the Levant. These aren't glitches, they're patterns. It raises a powerful question. Who were our ancestors then? And why were their stories erased? Here's a piece of the puzzle most never hear in school. For centuries before the transatlantic slave trade, African empires like Mali, Songhai, and Ghana had global influence. The Moors, Black and Berber Muslims from North Africa, ruled parts of Europe for over 700 years. They were scholars, seafarers, architects, and map makers. Some historians argue that long before Columbus, Moorish explorers sailed across the Atlantic, bringing culture, language, and genetics to the Americas. They didn't arrive in chains. They came as navigators. Some DNA studies suggest that Black Americans carry traces of these Moorish lineages, a blend of African, Berber, and Semitic bloodlines that connect them not just to West Africa, but to North Africa, Arabia, and the Mediterranean world. If this is true, and the science suggests it might be, then the identity of Black Americans is not just African. It's indigenous, it's global, and it's royal. Here's why this is so dangerous to the system. If Black Americans have pre-Columbian roots, and if their DNA ties them to both ancient Americans and global civilizations, then calling them descendants of slaves is a massive historical downgrade. That label was never just about history, but control. When you define someone by slavery, you erase their sovereignty. But the truth in your blood tells a different story. It says, you were here before the boats. You were kings, queens, and builders. You were indigenous to this land and connected to lands across the sea. You weren't just brought here, you gave here shape. This isn't a fantasy. This is what the DNA is starting to whisper. And if we listen closely, it may just change everything we thought we knew about ourselves. Our roots didn't begin in chains. They were covered by them. What if the reason they buried this DNA research was because the truth would shift the balance of power forever? Let's be clear, if Black Americans are not just descendants of enslaved West Africans, but are the original people of this land, the implications are earth-shattering. Because suddenly, we're not just talking about history, we're talking about land, ownership, sovereignty, and legal rights. If Black Americans can prove deep indigenous lineage, not through colonizers' records, but through their blood, then who has the rightful claim to millions of acres across the United States? Who truly owns the land your great-grandparents were forced off of? And who is owed more than just reparations, but restoration? This is why the system fights back. Because rewriting the origin story of Black Americans means redistributing power. And let's not pretend. Power fears memory. If Black Americans are proven to have pre-slavery roots in America, that means the African American label becomes questionable, maybe even weaponized. Think about that. By lumping everyone into one category, African American, the narrative becomes simple. You came from somewhere else. We brought you here. Be grateful. That's your story. But if DNA shows that many Black Americans have indigenous American, Moorish, Berber, or ancient Semitic markers, that tidy narrative collapses. And so does the illusion of who belongs here and who doesn't. This truth doesn't just shake America. It shakes the entire world. Because if Black Americans aren't solely West African, what does that mean for Pan-Africanism as it's currently defined? Are we ignoring ancient connections between indigenous Americans and Africans that go far beyond slavery? And are we missing the opportunity to unite not just through pain, but through shared legacy? Not just, where are we from? But, who benefits from us never knowing? The answer is just uncomfortable, because systems of control, whether they be economic, political, or educational, all depend on one thing: your identity being defined for you, not by you. That's why this isn't just about chromosomes, it's about chains, the invisible ones. The scariest truth for the establishment is, you are not lost, you were hidden, and your blood just blew the cover off the greatest story never told. And that's why they needed this DNA study to disappear. But it's too late, because you already started watching this. Wait until we get to something even scarier. It would surprise you that millions of Black Americans are also of Native Americans whose history was deliberately erased, not through time, but through paper. This isn't a metaphor, it's what historians call paper genocide. See, in the late 1800s and early 1900s, government agents reclassified tens of thousands of Native Americans as colored or black, often without consent and a trace of their true tribal identity. Entire nations vanished, not from the land, but from the record books. Tribes like the Yamasee, Washita, Eastern Blackfoot, Lumbee, and even branches of the Choctaw and Cherokee were forcibly renamed and absorbed into a racial category that erased their sovereignty, land claims, and heritage. They didn't disappear, they were rebranded. Why? One major reason: the Dawes Act of 1887. This law was supposed to divide native lands into parcels for individual ownership. But here's the catch: only recognized Indians could receive land. So, the US government created the Dawes Rolls to determine who was Indian enough. Guess what happened next? If your skin were dark, you didn't make the list. Even if your entire family spoke the language, followed the customs, and lived on ancestral land, if you didn't look native by European standards, you were labeled black. Just like that, the lands were lost, tribes were erased, and generations grew up never knowing they had indigenous roots. The one-drop rule, originally used to control and marginalize African ancestry, became a tool to erase native identity also. But now, DNA is doing what the history books refuse to. Today, genetic studies are revealing what many families only heard whispered by their grandmothers: that their roots were deeper than the slave ships, that their blood remembers names and nations long deleted. Markers that were once hidden are now surfacing, showing links to ancient indigenous populations of the southeastern United States. Oral traditions once laughed at are now confirmed by science. What does this mean? It means the truth is coming back, not just through labs, but through memory, through language, and ancestral pride. It means Black Americans may not just be from Africa, they may also be the original people of this land, erased only on paper, never in spirit. And perhaps the biggest shock of all, the same system that tried to erase you is now being exposed by the very science it once controlled. Because your identity can't be buried forever. It was just sleeping, waiting for you to reclaim it. We're not here to deny the African in Black American identity. Far from it. But let's be real. We've been fed a watered-down version. A version that starts at chains and ends at plantations. But Africa's story, your story, didn't begin on a slave ship. It began in empires, universities, and sacred cities that the textbooks barely whisper about. Let's talk about the Mali Empire. One of the richest and most advanced civilizations the world has ever known. Historians like Ivan van Sertima have documented how Mansa Abubakari II, Emperor of Mali, sent a fleet of hundreds of ships across the Atlantic in the early 1300s, nearly 200 years before Columbus. His goal was the exploration, expansion, and contact, and there's mounting evidence, from inscriptions to architecture to oral traditions, that they reached the Americas. Then there's the Moors, African Muslims who ruled parts of Europe for over 700 years. These weren't primitive people. They brought libraries, science, astronomy, and medicine. And yes, they were expert navigators who mapped the seas long before Western colonizers picked up a compass. You see, the African story isn't confined to villages and colonization. Africa was global. Her children sailed seas, built cities, and left footprints on continents the world pretends they never touched. And DNA, it's confirming the breadcrumbs. Genetic studies reveal African lineages present in ancient American remains, from South America to the Mississippi Valley, far before the transatlantic slave trade began. So no, your African heritage doesn't begin in bondage. It began in brilliance. You are not the product of defeat. You are the descendant of explorers, inventors, kings, and queens. You were global citizens before the term ever existed. What they called slaves were the survivors of empires. And now, the blood in your veins is calling you back to remember, because once you understand where you truly come from, the lies can no longer hold power over your identity. And this is just one piece of the truth they tried to bury. The truth is far more powerful and far more dangerous to those who built their power on your amnesia. You are the legacy of seafarers who crossed oceans before Columbus ever touched a compass. You are the children of pyramid builders, not just in Africa, but in ancient America, where step pyramids still rise in silence. You descend from tribes wiped off the maps, their names erased, their languages outlawed, but their blood still running through your veins. You are the survivors of global empires, the Moors, the Malians, the indigenous nations, civilizations the world tried to forget, but your DNA never did. This isn't fantasy. It's science, it's evidence, it's memory resurfacing after centuries of silence. Let's pause for a moment. If your ancestors were already in America before slavery, if they had kingdoms, cultures, and sacred knowledge, if they built civilizations that predated and rivaled Europe's, then what does that mean for how we define Black identity today? It means the label African American may be too small for the weight your ancestry carries. It means we must rethink everything we've been taught, from history class to Hollywood. Because DNA isn't just about where you came from, it's about what was taken, what was buried, and now what's rising again. The truth is, your story began with royalty, invention, survival, and spirit. You are the remainder of a suppressed history so vast, even textbooks fear it. And the system feared this moment, the moment you remember. Because when you remember, you start to reclaim your story, your name, your land, and your identity. The power of this DNA revelation isn't just scientific, it's psychological, spiritual, and revolutionary. Suddenly, slave is no longer your starting point. It's a chapter in a story that began thousands of years before. And here's the twist. Many of the tribal names erased from American history, the Yamasee, Washita, Blackfoot, Creek, and Choctaw, weren't lost. They were reclassified, lumped under colored and Negro to wipe out land claims, culture, and sovereignty. But DNA has no interest in politics. DNA remembers what the system tried to erase. And now that you know, you can't unknow it. You're not just part of a struggle. You're part of a legacy. A lineage of brilliance, of builders, of storytellers, healers, warriors, and navigators. This is your inheritance. Not just survival, but dominion. Not just pain, but purpose. Not just history, but prophecy. The next time someone asks who you are, you don't just say, "I'm Black." You say, "I am the descendant of empires. My DNA is older than borders. My roots are deeper than slavery." Type it out in the comments if you're convinced it's true. And this isn't about rejecting Africa. It's about expanding your origin. Africa is your home, but so is America. So is the sea. So is the sky. Not the America they sold Taos, but the origin that once was several years ago. Your story wasn't lost. It was hidden. But now it's found. And now that you're remembering, they can never bury it again. Now is the time to reclaim the story they tried to delete. Get your DNA tested, but know what you're looking for. Many mainstream companies filter your ancestry through a narrow lens. The deeper story may not show up in percentages, but in the haplogroups, the migration patterns, the anomalies they don't explain. Learn to read between the lines. Your blood holds more than West Africa. It may carry ancient American roots, Semitic echoes, or Moorish codes. That's not fiction. That's science they don't want you to read. Reconnect with your tribal memory. Some of your grandmothers whispered the truth while the textbooks lied. Many black families today descend from reclassified native tribes, the system erased with ink. Look into your own family's oral history. You'll be shocked how many black families were once land-owning Indians before a census form changed everything. Read about our scholars. Don't just study what the schools gave you. Study what they refused to teach. Dr. Ivan van Sertima, Cheikh Anta Diop, Dr. Joy DeGruy, and Robin Walker. These names should be as familiar as Einstein or Darwin because they deal in truth. Your truth. And above all, question everything. The greatest act of rebellion is remembering. Don't wait for them to teach you. You are the curriculum. The revolution doesn't begin with protest signs. It begins with remembering. You are not a footnote in someone else's history. You are the story. You are the author. You are the beginning. You are the original, the witness, and the legacy. So reclaim your story, question their version, and pass the truth forward before it's buried again. You are not a footnote in someone else's story. You are the return. And now, the world has no choice but to hear the truth echo through your voice. It's time to take your story back.